Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Maury Humes. I'm a parishioner at All Souls Episcopal Church in Arlington, Texas. This is a companion video to a discussion that took place on September 22nd related to the season of creation. So this particular talk is intended to be for those who wanted to do maybe a little bit deeper dive than we were able to do in the discussion that day at the wellspring. So without further ado, let's push forward. So in the season of creation that takes place September 1st to October 4th each year, the Episcopal Church kind of chooses a theme, and in the recent years has chosen to interact with the Season of Creation website.org. So the Season of Creation website itself is not Episcopal Church specific. It's actually used by other churches as well. But the Episcopal Church references the information there, the themes there, etc. And so the theme this year is going to be the topic of today's talk. So if you go to the Episcopal Church website, you will find a lot of information, particularly now during the season of creation. And then you'll see the same thing when you go to the Season of Creation website, which is linked to from the Episcopal Church website. So we'll have those links a bit later. So you can see the flow here. And in the Season of Creation this year, to work with the specific theme, one of the primary topics brought out is something called a fossil fuel treaty. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the details of that, since that is such a large component of what you find in the church's position today. So without further ado, the theme this year, To Hope and Act with Creation, is basically drawn from a passage from Romans, a letter from Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 19 through 25. So without further ado, let's pull that up. I'm not going to belabor this here, but if you go back and read Romans, obviously Paul at the time wasn't talking about today's topics. He was talking about the struggles of the early church. But a lot of the language here about the problems in creation, some suffering, first fruits of the Spirit, a lot of that sort of rings true with problems that we kind of associate with today. And I think that's why this particular passage was chosen. So at the Episcopal General Convention in 2022, a particular statement was made, as you can see here, that kind of recognized climate change. You may be in the habit of calling it global warming. Generally here in North Texas, that's how we think of it. But considered it an all-encompassing social crisis and moral emergency. So obviously a topic worth our interest, our ability to investigate, understand, and possibly talk amongst ourselves. And at the bottom of the quote here, you can see that they were considering it a problem significant enough that it's going to require every sector of society, including the church, to deal with this. So in today's talk, I would like for you to have two takeaways. The first takeaway basically being educating ourselves. So taking from the prior chart and their discussion there, what can we do to understand the issues of the day and educate ourselves so that we're smarter on the individual topic. On the second point, there's a lot of good things happening. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of feeling as though the problem is completely unaddressed and we're starting from scratch. hence the term here, first fruits, kind of describing, we're at the very beginning. And I don't think that's quite a correct categorization. I think there is a lot of work to be done, and I think everyone needs to be aware of what's happening and continue to make progress. And I guess there is a pretty strong question as to whether we're making progress fast enough, but nonetheless, there are good things happening. So we're going to talk about those as well. So before we get started, a little bit of a story. The question here on the chart seems more absurd every year. Is climate change real? Several of the past years now have been listed. All you have to do is turn on the Weather Channel and see that it's the hottest recorded summer, hottest recorded year, hottest recorded winter. It seems like almost every year we hear that, or maybe it's the second hottest since 2016. So it's, an obvious issue, I think, kind of moving forward. So why is there even any conversation about that? So maybe if we can understand that for a moment, we can kind of reassure ourselves about what we're talking about here. So in the 1600s, probably really starting a bit earlier than that, maybe in the later 1500s, 1575-ish, there was a movement in the Netherlands to go outside and paint the landscapes, paint what you see outside rather than still lifes or portraits or things that were popular before that time. And so artists went outside. They generally tended to depict a lot of scenes that involved people, but they look a little bit like the pictures that we're seeing here on the screen now, which were paintings where humans weren't in the landscape. They weren't the focus of the painting. They were just small figures doing what people do. And in these cases, in the winter, you can see scenes with extensive ice flows, frozen lakes, frozen canals. And at the time, the better paintings were collected and put in collections and in museums. But later on, people began to look at this more in the modern day and realized that they recognized the landmarks in the paintings and realized that, say, for instance, in the painting here at the left, that this implies that in London, there was a serious freezing of the river. So what does that mean? At first the thought maybe was that these were fantasy type paintings, but looking at it later, the realization was that people were painting what they saw, which means that things acted very different back then in the winter. So this kind of gave rise to the term the Little Ice Age. Similar story from Glacier Bay. If you go to their website, there was information in the area about Klingets, their villages, where they were located. The tribe has a very strong oral history, always has for many hundreds of years. And so as the early fur traders, typically Russian, maybe a few other English that made their way up there, kind of interacted with the villagers at that point, they understood that the landscape as they saw it at that time was very different, just 100 years earlier. So in 1680, from all of that information, they were able to kind of capture that at Glacier Bay, in this case, the glacier, as you see it, was retracted a bit from the sea, and there was some area there for a village that was very fine for fishing and hunting. The location of today's visitor center, which is on the water, was kind of in the middle of a low-lying land space. Push that forward to 1750, when the fur traders really began to come in force, and you can see that the glacier had extended extensively way out into the bay, all the way into, all the way out into the surrounding water. So this was known because there were a lot of traders up in this area in 1750. Push it forward to 1880, and all of that glacier now has melted and pulled back so that you have to now travel well up into the bay in order to see the glaciers and find them. So the thing to note about this is that all of this has occurred well before our industrial age, our industrial revolution, and the carbon emissions that we're so familiar with today really weren't going by 1880. So you can see a case where local climate impacts are having significant effects prior to the impact of our modern society. If you extend it forward, though, to today, you can now see that the glaciers of Glacier Bay are considerably retracted. So you have to travel well back up to see the glaciers themselves. So in 1902, they did that. This particular scene is a scene of a tourist boat in Glacier Bay that was going back up to look at the ice. And as you can see, they've already found some here. And at this stage, they had to wait for the spring, early summer for enough melting to occur in the bay so that they could see this particular scene. So if you fast forward that to today, you see that at about that same time frame, there is no ice. In fact, the snow, even on the slopes, has melted, and the appearance of the bay at this point is a complete late summer appearance, as though there's no more effects of winter whatsoever. So this is now happening way earlier. So obviously we see these impacts on the ground. So let's look at this a little bit scientifically here. I have a chart. This is an estimated temperature chart coming from modeling. And the modeling itself is covering the last 1,000 years. So ice cores that were collected, these primarily from Greenland, are great and wonderful stores of information. And one of the things that we can get out of them is something of a climate history. And looking at the last 1,000 years, this particular chart shows 3 different transitions in relative temperature. So you can see things transitioning each year compared to the year before. And in the case of the red and green lines, which are meant to capture the entire northern hemisphere, there is a slight downward trend. Not much. I mean, we're only talking less than a ½ degree centigrade over the entire time period from 1000 to 1900 AD. But the blue line is more interesting. You have a period here of medieval warm times where the temperature climbed precipitously, and then where those paintings were executed back in the late 1600s, that's become known as the Little Ice Age. And so you can see a significant movement up and then down in this temperature, but this temperature is local to central England. So we're not talking about a very large space. We're talking about a singular, kind of almost singular location on the planet. So you can see there's a lot more variance locally than there is over the entire globe, which would kind of be expected. If you fast forward this, though, a little bit up to 1900, you can now see that from a relative perspective, all the temperatures are collected at that point. And then from 1900 moving forward, the upward trend is absolutely consistent. All 3 lines are moving together. No longer is it just a singular local place in central England that's climbing. The entire northern hemisphere is moving forward. And this chart ends in the year 2000. So the temperature climb has only gone up since then. So this chart is a chart of atmospheric CO2. The top scraggly line there is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, measured in parts per million. As it turns out, CO2, even at what we would consider to be high concentrations, is still a very, very small component of the atmosphere. It doesn't take very much to have a significantly outsized effect. The bottom portion, where you kind of see the red and bluish line, that's a measure of temperature. And again, these were Antarctic ice cores, I think exclusively taken there. And as you can see, at times where the carbon dioxide is high, the global temperature is high, and at parts where the concentration is low, temperatures are low. So nothing much new here. As we were coming into the modern era, we were on an upswing. We know from obviously having studied all our lives that there were ice ages here, extensive glaciers, woolly mammoths, etc., and that they ceased to exist as the temperatures warmed. So there was already a significant temperature increase, and that's not unusual. As you go back through the last million years, you can see that happening. The outlier, though, is here, where carbon dioxide concentration now has extended well beyond anything that we've seen in the last million years. So that's really the thing that should have everyone concerned. So I think with this we can conclude that even though there's been unusual occurrences, local variances, temperatures have gone up and down naturally, I think the fact that human activity is now impacting things moving forward is kind of unassailable. So if you're watching this video, I assume you're probably familiar with the greenhouse effect and that there are gases that are basically carbon-based for the most part, CO2 being the one that catches the most headlines, although methane is actually a very prominent warming gas as well. In both cases, you see that capital C there, meaning that they come from various different carbon-based scenarios. The majority of these two gases do come from burning fossil fuels, although there are a few other sources that we'll probably get to in part 2. So a little bit of greenhouse effect obviously is a good thing. I think without that, our planet would look very different, possibly not even inhabitable by humans. But too much, which is kind of what we're beginning to experience now, is going to have consequences that we probably don't really understand very well now. So this didn't go without gaining attention, obviously. In 2015, there was a global conference of all countries, for the most part, in Paris, France. And at that conference, there was a agreement attached. And the sort of summary of that was an attempt to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius worldwide. So that was the goal as stated in this agreement. But what actually happens is that countries are left to kind of come up with their own initiatives, their own attempts to get to this goal. And as such, there has been some frustration that hasn't been moving as quickly as it needs to be. As you can see in the last bullet here, 2025 was kind of the deadline for peaking for greenhouse gas emissions, with a significant decline needing to occur by 2030. If that didn't happen, the feeling was that we wouldn't control global warming to 1.5 C. So, to that end, we have a new initiative that has been discussed. This is called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if you go back and do the research that I mentioned on the National Episcopal Church website and the Season of Creation, you'll see this treaty referenced multiple times. So let's investigate a little bit about what it is. So again, from the seasonofcreation.org website, this is the term, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, obviously borrowed from the Nuclear Weapon Non-Proliferation Treaty. Kind of used that term there. But the idea is to phase down and out of fossil fuel production. The thinking being that if we stop production, that will be a forcing function to, kickstart much stronger initiatives to address the problem. So here we're going to kind of look at that in a little bit of detail. And then after that, really more in part two than part one, we're going to discuss some educational aspects just to kind of bring ourselves up to speed on various things that would go above and beyond what this treaty discusses. So if you look at the website, there is a website for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this is a graphic from there. So we're really talking about three different, as they refer to them here, pillars. The first being to stop building out the problem. So basically their proposal in this treaty would be to stop all new exploration and drilling for fossil fuels now, whether that be coal, natural gas, oil, etc. Leaving the economic impacts of that aside, you can see the logic here that at this point, the only way to begin to meet the Paris Agreement initiatives is to greatly increase the speed. I think it's probably a little naive economically, but you get the frustration, right? Things aren't really happening probably as soon as they need to. Phase two, or maybe a better way to phrase it, pillar two, is an equitable plan for winding down on production. So the idea is that today, if you look at the world, there are locations like the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, several other locations that produce a great deal of the world's fossil fuels. And as a result, they are rich in these fossil fuels. So if we were to stop production, new production altogether, and just simply play out what we currently have, people, say in Africa, that don't have their own fossil fuel production are driving gasoline-driven cars. And so they need something to help them get around. So I think the idea would be that the more established countries would help in these areas, probably by sending gasoline, among other things, to help make this transition conceivable. Then finally, a serious increase in the fast tracking of renewable energy, whether that be wind energy, solar, etc. So it would be a natural conclusion that if you're not going to continue to drill for fossil fuels, then you would need to move into renewable energy at a breakneck pace. And so that would be the third pillar of the treaty. So they have, as I said, a website, fossilfueltreaty.org, and you can see here that there is a call to join the initiative. Now, what does that mean? There is no document written yet. There is no actual treaty. When I first read this off of the seasonofcreation.org website, I assumed that there was a constructed treaty that you could go read, and the idea was that people would then just vote to kind of approve it or join it or suggest it, etc. But actually, there is no treaty done. It's ideas like what we saw on the prior slide. So at this stage, that's more or less what we're talking about. So through that website, they have a discussion here about endorsing the concept. So it can be done as a government, it can be done as a city, as an organization, or as an individual. So anyone who wants to can sign their name to this. Since there's no current existing treaty, what you're probably really endorsing is that something new needs to happen. That's kind of what you're saying. And this is their initiative to do that. The nation states that have discussed this, of course, are very small in quantity, and they do tend to be very small countries. There certainly is nothing akin to large European countries, China, the United States, Japan, etc. None of the large industrial countries have yet endorsed this concept. In those cases, the Paris Agreement that was done earlier is kind of what is quote unquote enforced. So that's what this website is really advocating for. So, what I would think is that if you would be interested potentially in endorsing something like that, another natural follow on would then be to understand what we can do above and beyond a treaty, what can be done at a grassroots level. So, to that end, we're going to touch a little bit here on our own carbon footprints, how we can understand them, actions small, potentially large, that could be done, and to kind of understand that, although most of that's actually going to take place in part 2 of our conversation. So, before we get started, a small quiz here. This particular table was taken from a Financial Times website, and in it, the article was discussing people's understanding of actions that they could personally take to help with CO2 emissions. So this is shown in tons, European tons, or actually English tons, I believe, per year. So they have all these actions, recycling as much as possible, replacing your car with electric or a hybrid, avoiding a long distance flight. So they have these things that you could do. And then the question is, or the question that was posed to the individuals at the time is, pick your top 3. What do you think that you could do to most help reduce CO2 emissions? So before we get to the results here, I would ask you, if you're watching this on recording, to pause and basically just look at the list for a moment, kind of make your own assessment in your own mind, and then we'll reveal the answer. Okay, so I assume that you did that and you're ready to see the results here. So, the way this is shown is that these blue kind of vertical line tick marks are the individual results per country. So this was done across the globe in many different countries. And so for ones like, say, buying renewable energy, where there's a split out there, where the tick marks kind of range from the lower end of the scale to the higher. And so to read this, the very beginning of the left part of the chart shows 0. So that would be 0% of the people thought that was a good idea or would be helpful for CO2 emissions. And then as you move to the right-hand side, you begin to get above 60. That's starting to say that probably 2 in 3 people thought that was a good idea. So in this case, recycling as much as possible was a very popular choice. You can see that worldwide, it was almost 60% of the people had that in their top list, somewhere in their top 3. And then as you can move down, you can see that the list here is pretty much in order. Well, actually, it is in order, as shown by the results of what people said. So they had recycling as their top choice, say eating a plant-based diet was at the bottom. If you actually look at the impacts of these actions, you can see that each has a positive impact, but it varies. Like, say, for instance, replacing incandescent light bulbs is a nice thing to do, but really on a global scale, it pales in comparison to other actions that you can take. But as you can see, it showed up fairly high on the list at almost 40% of the people, assuming that was certainly in their top 3. As you work down the list, you can see that things like not having a car, being probably one of the largest, showed up very low. I do have a little bit of problem with the very bottom number. I'm not sure where this 58.6 came from. The article wasn't particularly clear on that point. You will see in part 2 that the average American today puts out approximately 16 tons per year total, and that's average, not someone who is trying to make a change in their lifestyle. I find it hard to believe that a child can possibly have 58 per year. In fact, if you take that number and divide it by 18, it starts to become a little bit more believable. But so maybe 58 was the total for a child's entire childhood up to 18, maybe. I don't know. But I kind of left it there just simply because it was, very much seen as, one of the lowest items. And it does bring out the point that we're going to have carbon emissions. That's just humans existing on the planet. We will. So we just need to understand potentially kind of how to make that better. So with that, how do we do better? What could possibly be done? And a lot of this is the products that we choose. We tend to use things in our lives. We don't walk everywhere. We tend to drive vehicles now. We tend to ride transportation. We use products in our homes. We keep our food cold so that they don't make us sick later. There are a lot of things that we do in our modern world, all of which have potential impacts on CO2 emissions. But if you look at our history, we basically make product choices based on cost, or we make them based on features. So how fast can something go? Potentially, there are things that could have a carbon insight, such as miles per gallon. It is a very nice measure of a car's impact on the environment, but not all products are anywhere near that clear. And so the majority, you probably don't have any real vision as to what the impact of purchasing and supporting a certain brand or product would have. So this was not that different, say, in the area of the foods that we eat. In this case, prepackaged foods. Before 1990, the labels that we're all very familiar with now didn't exist. You couldn't know the total calories of something that you were buying, particularly the breakdown of those calories into the various different components. So in 1990, this became a law. And so today, you go to the grocery store and virtually every prepackaged product has this information stamped on it. There are very few exceptions. And so it helps you make choices. You can look and choose based on total calories, total fat calories, saturated fat, whatever's important to you. You can find that information and choose your foods based on that. So what if we were to do the same thing for our products related to, say, for instance, the carbon footprint? So here we have a vehicle, and we're going to consider whether, what is our carbon impact from choosing to buy this particular vehicle. Well, as it turns out, every vehicle has a carbon footprint to manufacture it. Things have to be sourced. Everything from the metals involved to the plastics to the circuitry, the engine components, everything requires a certain carbon footprint to make it. And when you get done with that, you basically manufacture it, deliver it, and then everyone then can now purchase it, and you're already in a carbon deficit at that point when you're buying this from an individual or dealer, wherever you're getting it from. So at that stage, you begin there. But as we know with cars, there is a carbon footprint to using it. So in this case, coming up with a complete life cycle would require us to define some standard. We would have to indicate what is it the expected average product or example of this product class. So in this case, let's say we took a four-door sedan and we said that its situation is considered the average. Well, we can go through and basically begin to look at our cumulative footprint savings. So since we're talking about a hybrid, the idea is that it could most likely get a much better miles per gallon measure than this average. And so cumulatively, you would be saving in your carbon footprint per year. So at the end of 7 years, for instance, these aren't real numbers. A bit of my point here is I could not find real numbers. So those are not available to us at this time. The picture here would be one where this car, after 7 years, would become carbon neutral. You would have saved as much of carbon output through usage of the car as was expended in creating it. So at least your impact on the world through the use of this product, again, compared to the average, is considered carbon neutral. So this would be the kind of thing that you would need to do for carbon footprint labeling. It's quite a bit more difficult than how many calories are in a Twinkie. So I think, this is what makes it difficult. Different products might be much easier. Ones that don't tend to expend carbon as you use them would be easier to deal with, because in that case, just the manufacturing would be the issue. Here's another example. In this case, we have a car that gets less miles per gallon than our standard. And so in this case, the carbon footprint in total life cycle is much more than just the manufacturing, because now this car is not doing as well as our presumed standard each year. So at least going in as a consumer, you can understand all of this. So there's consumer behavior involved here as well. Let's take a typical car. We'll see this example in part 2. And for a typical car, a typical American, probably a higher use than maybe average in my assessment, but nonetheless, about 4.45 tons of CO2 would be expended per year by this vehicle to drive around. That figure is about 250 miles a week. If you were able to simply reduce your driving, you live close to where you work, you don't have a long commute, you telecommute where possible, you do the different things that you can do to reduce your use of that car, whether it be carpooling, etc., you can drop that figure, right? It can come right down. And so even someone driving a vehicle that on a per mile basis is very inefficient, their individual behavior on a per year basis could be much smaller. You can make a similar kind of impact by choosing a product that is more efficient, in this case a hybrid, which would reduce your expenditure down to about 2.57. So as you can see, you can make those balanced choices based on either your behavior or your product choices. So in this case, we're looking at, say, a plug-in hybrid. So plug-in hybrids work by having a much greater battery capacity, and in fact, an ability to move the vehicle a fair amount solely on electrical power, assuming those batteries are fully charged. And if you can reduce the amount you drive every day so that you rarely engage the gasoline engine, your footprint will look very different. You will actually begin to make up that manufacturing footprint right away and actually begin to lessen. So I guess in this case, you're not carbon neutral, you're carbon negative. You're actually helping the problem much more than just simply not contributing new to it. So in this case, that would be the individual case for this car. And then as you extended that usage potentially even farther, that accumulation will increase and increase and increase. So these kinds of behavior decisions can potentially help. Unfortunately, we have none of this information other than occasional pieces of cost information like miles per gallon. We have no idea what the manufacturing footprint is for various vehicles. We have no idea what it is for Toyota, Ford, Honda, etc. And so you can't make your choices based on that. So there could be a lot of value in this type of labeling on products to help individuals make a better choice. I think people have shown that if given information and given an understanding, they may make choices that are positive, and it would also impact manufacturers. If people started buying Honda vehicles instead of Toyota, or the other way around, because one of the manufacturers had found a way of greatly reducing their carbon footprint, a manufacturer per car, then that would be something that may impact user or consumer decisions, which then would subsequently impact what the manufacturers do, and they would start to try to reduce their carbon footprint. So that brings us to part two.